Hello, and welcome to Medieval Lols, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. I'm Mary Wellesley.
And I'm Irina Dumitrescu.
And we're both writers, literary historians, and contributors to the paper. In this series, we're asking, was the Middle Ages funny? And to answer that today, we're looking at a series of 13th or 14th century old French tales about bed tricks and hijinks. These are, of course, the Fabliaux. We should say at the top that this episode contains fairly graphic discussion of sexual themes. Okay, Irina, let's start. What are the Fabliaux?
So the Fabliaux are short, witty tales in verse. That's the basic definition of them. There are about 160 or so of them in French, mostly anonymous, from the north or northwest France. They're being written between the 12th and 14th centuries and gathered in big manuscript collections of them. And they tend to feature quick-witted, spry characters. There's a lot of trickery. There's a lot of cleverness. There's quite a bit of debate. And the thing that really distinguishes them as a genre is that they're very interested in physical things. They're interested in bodies, in sex, and in money. So a lot of the characters are often lower class, and they're supposed to have a kind of rustic, interest in the material aspects of life. Scholars have had various kinds of theories over the ages. They used to, think that the audience of the Fabliaux must have been lower class because who else could sully their ears with such sexual material and such rude topics? Then they decided maybe it's actually upper-class people who enjoy listening to stories about peasants discussing rude topics. And I think now the idea is more that there is probably a mixed audience, and who knows, maybe also urban audiences, merchants, all kinds of people might have enjoyed these. It's a little bit silly to assume one rank of person likes witty and or filthy material more than another. But that's what we have. And what we have are the stories.
Yeah, and so listeners who've heard the first episode of this series, The Miller's Tale, Chaucer's Miller's Tale, that's a really perfect example in English of an English writer taking this very well-established form from Old French and kind of reusing it in Middle English. So listeners may have come across these kinds of texts before, but in their kind of English manifestation, or if they've read any Boccaccio, Boccaccio also used this kind of form a lot and put them into these kind of large collections in a sort of different and quite literary way, but nonetheless the basic form is there. It's the kind of, I would say it's the sort of tabloid journalism of.
Well, I'm struggling to think of a genre that's like that today exactly. But are they the TikToks of the? I don't know. Chaucer's Reeve's Tale is also based on a French Fabliaux, so it's they're quite. I think they're definitely funny. We can get that out of the way. I hope we can convey that in today's episode. But they're also very tightly crafted. We saw that in The Miller's Tale, where one event sets off all kinds of other events, like dominoes. That's part of the aesthetic pleasure of these, that they're aware of language and the plotting is very well considered. So there's not a lot of space for accidental materials. And that also makes it fun to read because you can actually ask the questions like, what is this doing here? Why is this detail here and not another?
Yeah, and to just kind of jump in there without completely butchering the comedy to death. But, if you just think about the form, these are generally octosyllabic couplets. And so it's quite it's a springy little line that doesn't leave a lot of space for kind of, word, pointless sort of lexical clutter. Like you kind of really get to the point quite quickly. And so the form really suits often the topics that are being discussed because a lot of it is sometimes really quite wonderfully graphic description of things that are going on often in beds or in other locations.
So why don't we jump right into
let's jump right in.
A Fabliaux. This is, that they have different titles depending on what the editors have given them as a title. But this Fabliaux that we'll talk about today is called La Demoiselle qui n'oit parler de fautre, qui n'ose mal au cœur. Which Nathaniel Dubin, who is our translator and editor for today, has a big collection of Fabliaux, really wonderful to read, calls The Maiden Who Couldn't Abide Lewd Language, which I find funny because he's already cleaned it up in the title. It's actually The Maiden Who Could Not Stand to Hear a Fucking without getting sick. So this is where we begin. So why don't we tell the story?
Okay, so we have a young woman, and they're clearly quite well off.
She and her father.
She and her father. Sorry, yes, she and her father. They're clearly quite well off. They're able to afford household help, domestic servants, but she says that she just can't abide having any servants in the house because then they would just constantly talk about fucking, basically, and or cock or balls, etc. is the wonderful translation. And so she says, we just can't have people like that in the house. I can't hear it. And so they're forced to look after themselves within the house. So already the first joke, like imagine how terrible for these fancy people that they are having to clean their own house or whatever.
And do all the yard work and so on. So there's a little bit of a class joke there already, right? That the peasants or the rustics, the lower classes, just call a spade, and the upper classes need some kind of special language, right? They need a more elaborate, euphemistic language. But it's also kind of weird because she seems to be calling the shots, right? Dad just does what she says.
Mm-hmm.
There's no mother here. She just says, well, it makes me sick. It's not even that she doesn't enjoy, she doesn't like it, or that she's offended. She becomes physically ill. And so you think she's going to be like the 13th century version of a snowflake, that she's not going to be able to withstand much at all. That turns out not to be the case. But
I mean, it's a long-standing erotic trope, right? The seemingly tentative maiden who doesn't seem very keen, but turns out actually she is. Spoiler alert, listeners.
So into this context comes a young man, David, who is clever and charming, and he arrives in town and he's just trying to find some way to get some cash or some food. And he hears about this young woman and about her father and this ridiculous situation they have where the father has to do all of the work in the hot sun on his own. And he asks for work. And the father basically says, well, I can't because my daughter can't stand to hear these words, which David pretends to be just as fragile as she is and starts saying, oh, no, please, don't say anything like that. I can't. I get sick even at the thought.
And then we have this wonderful moment in which David announces, all the things that he's able to do. He's, he can plow and he can plant, he can thresh, he can winnow, and probably the attentive listener at this point, because we're probably imagining that these texts were performed. There's kind of oral performance to them.
Group.
Exactly. Perhaps someone reading aloud and people, joking. There's a sort of social element to the way in which these texts are received. And so already, the ploughing and the winnowing, perhaps you might see the innuendo here already. So then David is then employed by this man.
But can I just say, it's actually the daughter. Even here, it's the daughter who runs out and says, we have to hire this man. Because maybe she's fallen for the trick, but this is the one man who seems to be as squeamish about dirty language as she is. So she's found her guy. And then, just to make it a little odder, when they have to bed him for the night, the father doesn't quite know where to put him, and the daughter says, well, he can share my bed with me, or he can sleep with me. Maybe it's in the same room and so on. Dad seems okay with the situation, so he puts David in the room with his daughter. And then David doesn't really lose any time in acting, does he?
No. So his first act, as we're told, is to place his hand on her bare bosom. And he asks her, well, what is this called?
Because he doesn't know any dirty words. How would he know what breasts are called?
And she says, well, they're my breasts, so white and fair, and in no way shameful or unclean. So then he slides his hand down between her legs, below the abdomen, as the translation decorously puts it. The hole one puts one's penis in, it then goes on to say. And he felt the first hairs newly growing, all soft and silky, barely showing. Exploring with his right hand, he again asks what that thing might be.
And she tells him it's her pasture, which is not much overgrown. So I guess there's not, or in the French, it's not flowered yet. It hasn't flowered yet. She's clearly post-pubescent. We get that sense from the description of her pubic hair. So, she would be old enough to have sex, but she hasn't had sexual experience yet. But she also doesn't seem particularly upset that his hand is there.
Exactly. And he says, and here in the middle of your fine meadow, what's this puddle, this slippery, soft, ditch-like thing?
And she calls that her spring, which is not yet overflowing. There's not yet fluid coming out of it the way there should be out of a spring. But it goes on. Davy continues exploring.
And then he says, and can you tell me what's ensconced down here?
And this is one of my favorite parts. Maybe I'll read it in the French as well as the English. C'est les corneres qui la garde, fait la pucelle pour verte. Se best entroit de dans mon pré pour boivre en la fontaine claire, tantost corneroit li cornere pour faire li honte et peur. Why, that's the bugler, Davy dear, the maiden says, who's standing sentry. If man or beast sought to gain entry and try to drink from my clear spring, the sentry would start trumpeting and strike his heart with fear and shame. All right, can we pause here for a moment before we go on?
Yep.
What's going on?
Well, I think what's very interesting is that, as you say, this appears to be a consenting encounter, right, in which he is asking her about these parts of her body and asking her to describe them in her own terms. And it's quite I mean, of course, it is nonetheless disturbing to a modern audience that he's describing a woman who's clearly young. I mean, what we today would think of as probably underage. That is, of course, disturbing, but it's unfortunately a kind of medieval trope.
But on the other hand, we've had it set up that she's in charge.
Yeah.
Right? She's in charge of her father's, household. And she's in charge of hiring Davy. And she's the one who puts him in her own bedroom. So there is this weird, when I first read this poem, I thought it was a setup to a rape scene. I thought he would trick her because she was so naive and she couldn't take the language. That he would somehow fool her into having sex. And that happens in some Fabliaux, right? And that it's about fooling the more innocent person into a sexual encounter that they can't really consent to, right? That seems to be the setup. Here's this strange man, this woman who can't even hear, the language about sexuality. He's going to trick her. But she's the one who puts him in her bed, and she is consenting the whole time. It's really, it could be, a guide today to consensual sex, right? Because he's sort of asking at every stage. And she seems to be just, it's kind of odd also because, today I think the advice is to teach children to use the proper, really clear words for their private parts so that they can speak about their body in a direct way and not hide what might happen to it. But she seems to be more comfortable with the metaphorical language. She just doesn't like the words for the things, but she's okay with the parts of the body themselves. And she's not ashamed at all of her vulva, of her asshole, of her breasts, of anything. The parts of the body themselves are not dirty.
If you enjoy hearing about medieval literature, you can listen to our full 12-episode series, Medieval Beginnings, right now as part of the LRB's Close Readings podcast subscription. Sign up directly in Apple Podcasts or in other podcast apps. There are links for these below.